A poor single mother was kicked out with her elderly grandmother from her uncle's house, but what they found in the desolate desert changed everything. If you want to discover their incredible turn of fate, subscribe now. Tell us which city you are listening from today. Now, let's begin. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a sound like a clap of thunder, a final, brutal punctuation mark on a lifetime of memories. The sound echoed in the sudden ringing silence, leaving Elena standing on the cracked concrete porch, the cold air biting at her exposed skin. In her arms, her baby, Leo, stirred and whimpered, sensing the violent shift in their world. Beside her, her grandmother, Sophia, stood impossibly straight, her thin frame wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her face a mask of dignified grief. The leaden-gray sky overhead seemed to press down on them, heavy with unshed tears, mirroring the crushing weight in Elena's own heart. Through the small wavy glass pane of the living room window, she could see them, her uncles. Luis, the elder, stood with his hands on his hips, his face a grotesque mixture of triumph and contempt. His cruel smile was a slash across his fleshy face. Jorge, the younger brother, hovered behind him, his expression a miserable cocktail of fear and complicity. He wrung his hands, unable to meet Elena's gaze, a coward hiding in his brother's formidable shadow. They were vultures who had been waiting patiently for this moment, for the final piece of their inheritance to be cleared away. Luis held up a piece of paper, tapping it against the glass with a thick, triumphant finger. It was a deed, a legal document stamped and signed, but it was a lie forged in greed. It claimed the house, their home, now belonged to him and Jorge. The house her grandfather, Arturo, had built with his own 2 hands. The house where her mother, Maria, had been born and had died only 6 months ago. The house that held every single memory Elena possessed. "It's done." Luis's voice was a muffled, ugly sound through the glass, but the meaning was as clear as a knife's edge. "The house is ours. Now get off my property." Elena felt a surge of hot, righteous anger, a fire that momentarily burned away the cold shock. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Then louder, finding a strength she didn't know she had. "You can't do this to us. This is our home." Luis let out a short, barking laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a predator enjoying its kill. He made a shooing motion with his hand, as if they were stray animals. "It's not your home anymore, you little brat. It's ours. Your mother is gone. There's no one left to protect you." The word brat struck Elena like a physical blow. It was what he had always called her, a verbal jab meant to remind her of her place. Standing beside her, Sophia's voice, though frail, cut through the air with the sharpness of shattered glass. "Luis, Jorge, you are a disgrace to your father's name. You are a disgrace to me." Her body trembled, but her eyes were like hot coals, burning with a mother's terrible disappointment. Luis's smile faltered for a second. He took a step toward the window, his face darkening with rage. "You chose them over us, old woman," he snarled, his voice rough like sandpaper. "You always chose Maria, and now you choose her bastard brat over your own sons." He spat the words, and Elena flinched as if the venom had actually touched her. She pulled Leo closer, shielding his innocent face from the ugliness of the world. Jorge finally looked up, his eyes wide and pleading. "Luis, maybe we—" he started, his voice a weak whine. "Shut up, Jorge," Luis snapped, not even turning to look at his brother. His glare was fixed on Sophia. He took a menacing step toward the door, as if he might come out and physically remove them. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was that threat against her grandmother that broke something inside Elena. The pleading girl vanished, replaced by a cold, hard fury. She would not beg. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She remembered her mother's words from years ago, a quiet warning whispered late one night. "Be careful of your uncles, Elena. Their hearts have been eaten away by envy." At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, she understood completely. Elena turned to her grandmother, her own eyes now clear and resolved. "Let's go, Grandma," she said, her voice steady. She adjusted the weight of the sleeping baby in her arms. She reached down and picked up the single battered cardboard suitcase that sat by her feet. It contained all they had been allowed to take: a few changes of clothes, Leo's diapers, and the old woolen coat that had belonged to her mother. Everything else, the photos, the furniture, the ghosts of their past, was now imprisoned in that house with those two men. Sophia looked at her granddaughter, a flicker of pride in her tired eyes. She nodded slowly. Without another word, without a single glance back at the house that had been her entire world, she turned and began to walk down the short path to the street. Elena followed, her back straight, her head held high. Each step was an act of defiance. They walked away from the only home they had ever known, into a future as gray and uncertain as the sky above. A cold wind whipped around them, carrying the faint, cruel sound of Luis's laughter. But Elena didn't hear it. She was listening to a silent vow forming in her heart, a promise made to her mother's memory, a promise of survival. The road stretched out before them, a long black ribbon of asphalt cutting through an ocean of pale brown dust and skeletal cacti. It ran straight to the horizon, vanishing into a hazy, indifferent distance. The world felt vast and empty, a desolate landscape that offered no comfort, no solace. Hope was a word their hearts no longer seemed to remember. It felt like a foreign language, a concept from a life lived by someone else, long ago. Elena walked, one foot in front of the other, a mechanical motion that required no thought. Her arms ached from the weight of Leo, who was now awake and fussing, his small cries lost in the immense quiet of the desert. The cardboard suitcase bumped against her leg with every step, its handle digging into her palm. Her grandmother, Sophia, walked beside her, her steps slow but steady, her silence a heavy blanket between them. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, but its warmth was a distant memory. A chill was creeping into the air, a cold that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. After what felt like an eternity, Sophia stopped. "We need to rest, my child," she said, her voice thin and raspy. She sank down onto a dusty patch of earth by the side of the road, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Elena nodded, her own legs trembling with exhaustion. She carefully sat down beside her grandmother, shifting Leo in her lap to try and comfort him. She unbuttoned her thin shirt and tried to nurse him, but her body was too stressed, too empty. The baby's cries grew louder, more frantic, a sound of pure, helpless need that tore through Elena's already frayed nerves. It was the sound of her own failure. That desperate cry was a key, unlocking a painful memory she had tried so hard to keep buried. The scene flooded her mind, as vivid as if it were happening right now. A small, cheerful cafe, the smell of coffee and baked bread, sunlight streaming through the window. And across the table, Marco, the father of her child. She remembered the hopeful, nervous tremor in her voice as she told him she was pregnant. She saw his face change, the easy smile vanishing, replaced by a shuttered, cold expression. His eyes, which she had once thought were so kind, became hard and distant. "That is your problem, Elena," he had said, his words clipped and final. It was a mistake. He had stood up, thrown a few bills on the table, and walked out of her life without a single look back. He had abandoned her, just as her uncles had abandoned her now. Two betrayals, like two deep wounds that refused to heal. The memory was a fresh splash of salt on the raw agony of the present. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. She could not fall apart. Not here. Not now. Sophia reached out a wrinkled, trembling hand and placed it on Elena's arm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. "Do not let them poison you, Elena," Sophia said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "Hate is a poison you drink, expecting the other person to die. Your uncles, that boy. They are already sick with their own venom. Do not drink it with them. We must survive. For him." She nodded toward the crying baby. Her words were simple, a piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations, but they landed in Elena's soul with the weight of profound truth. Elena looked down at Leo's tear-streaked face, at his tiny, grasping fists. He was her reason. He was the only thing that mattered. The anger and the grief were still there, a churning sea inside her, but beneath them, a small, hard resolve began to form. Survival. It was no longer a vague hope. It was a command. They heard a sound in the distance, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. A pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, two bright eyes cutting through the deepening twilight. Hope, fragile and unwanted, fluttered in Elena's chest. A car. Someone could help them. She stood up, waving her free arm, her heart pounding. The truck, a large, dusty pickup, roared toward them. It didn't even slow down. It swerved slightly to the shoulder, and as it thundered past, it kicked up a blinding cloud of dust and gravel. The grit stung Elena's eyes and filled her mouth. She coughed, turning her body to shield the baby, her brief flicker of hope turning to bitter ash. The red taillights disappeared into the darkness, leaving them more alone than before, cloaked in a veil of someone else's indifference. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She sank back to the ground, the last of her strength gone. The night was falling fast, and the desert was coming alive with the unseen rustles and clicks of its nocturnal creatures. Fear, a primal and chilling presence, began to prickle at the edges of her consciousness. They were exposed. They were helpless. And then she saw it, far off the road, almost perfectly camouflaged by a thicket of mesquite and dry, skeletal bushes, was a shape. A dark, solid silhouette against the fading purple sky. It was low and square. It was a roofline. It was a house. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Was it a mirage? A trick of the dying light? She stared, unblinking, until her eyes ached. No, it was real. A structure, shelter. A wave of adrenaline shot through her, pushing back the exhaustion. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Look." She pointed with a trembling finger. Sophia squinted into the gloom. "I see it," she breathed. It could be abandoned. It could be dangerous. There could be anyone or anything inside. Every rational thought screamed at her to stay away. But the alternative was a night in the open desert, with a baby and an elderly woman, at the mercy of the cold and whatever else lurked in the darkness. There was no choice. Fear was a luxury they could no longer afford. With a deep breath, Elena got to her feet, hoisted the suitcase, and began to walk toward the dark shape, toward the unknown. The journey from the road to the house was a trial in itself. Thorny branches clawed at their clothes and skin, and the uneven ground threatened to twist an ankle with every step. The silence here was different, deeper, punctuated by the scuttling of unseen things. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and anticipation. Finally, they broke through the last line of tangled bushes and stood before it. It was an old adobe house, its earthen walls cracked and weathered by decades of sun and wind. Part of the roof had sagged, and the windows were dark, vacant eyes. It looked forgotten by time itself. But it was solid. It had 4 walls and a roof. It was shelter. Elena shifted Leo into one arm and pushed at the heavy wooden door. It resisted, swollen in its frame. She pushed harder, her shoulder pressed against the rough wood. With a low groaning protest, a sound like a suffering soul, the door scraped open just enough for them to squeeze through. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of dust, decay, and the faint, musty scent of mice. Moonlight, filtered through the grimy window panes, cast long, distorted shadows across the room, making familiar shapes seem monstrous. Elena's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. They were in a single large room. In the center, ghostly shapes huddled under dusty white sheets. A fireplace, black with old soot and draped in cobwebs, stood against the far wall. With trembling hands, Elena set the suitcase down and gently placed Leo on the bundled coat she'd carried. She moved cautiously toward the center of the room and pulled back one of the sheets. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs appeared, caked in a thick layer of dust. She pulled back another sheet, revealing a worn sofa, its stuffing peeking through several tiers. It was a home, or it had been, a long, long time ago. She explored further, her footsteps soft on the creaking floorboards. A doorway led to a small bedroom. Inside, there was a simple metal bed frame, a rickety dresser, and in the corner, a small wooden crib. The sight of the crib sent a strange pang through Elena's chest. Who had lived here? What family had sought refuge within these same walls? For the first time since the door of her old home had slammed shut, she felt something that wasn't pure, suffocating fear. It was a tiny, fragile spark of something else, a glimmer of hope. This place, this forgotten ruin, felt like a sanctuary. "It's dry," Sophia said from the doorway, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "It will protect us from the wind." She walked slowly into the room, her hand trailing along the dusty wall. She stopped, her head tilted. "This place," she murmured more to herself than to Elena. "It feels familiar?" Elena was too exhausted to question it. They were safe from the elements, and for now, that was enough. The first morning in the abandoned house dawned gray and cold, but it was a morning they had lived to see. Elena woke with a start from a restless sleep on the lumpy sofa, the baby stirring beside her. Her first thought was of water. They were desperately thirsty. Leaving Sophia and Leo inside, Elena stepped out into the crisp morning air. She circled the house, her eyes scanning the barren ground, and then she saw it, almost hidden by a cluster of overgrown weeds, a circle of flat stones, a well. Her heart leaped. She peered over the edge into the darkness. It looked deep. A rusty bucket on a frayed rope was still attached to the wooden crosspiece. With trembling hands, she lowered it, the rope creaking in protest. She heard a distant, beautiful splash. She hauled the rope up, her muscles straining. The bucket that emerged was heavy, sloshing with water that looked in the morning light astonishingly clear. She brought the water inside. They boiled it over a small fire she managed to start in the fireplace using dry twigs and a book of matches she found in her mother's coat pocket. The water was clean. It was life. Later that day, her search of the small dilapidated kitchen yielded another miracle. In a wooden cupboard, behind a door hanging by one hinge, she found sealed tins and glass jars, dried beans, rice, flour, preserved peaches. They were ancient, covered in dust, but they had been carefully stored. Someone had prepared this place for a long siege. That evening, they ate their first real meal in 2 days. A thin gruel of boiled rice, sweetened with a spoonful of peach syrup. It was the most delicious thing Elena had ever tasted. As they ate, a sense of purpose began to settle over her. This wasn't just a temporary shelter, it was a chance. They started to clean, to reclaim the space from the dust and the neglect. Elena swept the floors with a broom made from a broken branch, while Sophia, with her slow, deliberate movements, wiped down the table and chairs. They were making a home. As she worked, Sophia's comment from the night before echoed in Elena's mind. It feels familiar. What could she mean? The next day, while tackling the great stone fireplace, the source of their life-giving heat, Elena's hand brushed against something a brick that felt loose in the chimney breast. Curiosity piqued. She wiggled it. It moved. Her heart began to beat faster. Using the end of a fire poker, she carefully pried the brick out of its place. Behind it was a dark, hollow space. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. Her fingers closed around something hard and rectangular. A box. She pulled it out. It was a small wooden chest, bound with rusted iron straps. It was heavy. For a dizzying moment, she imagined gold or money, a hidden treasure that would solve all their problems. With Sophia watching, her eyes wide, Elena fumbled with the rusted latch. It wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she used the poker to force it open. The latch broke with a sharp crack. She lifted the lid. There was no gold. There was no money. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a bundle of old letters tied with a delicate faded blue ribbon. Beside them lay a small, leather-bound diary. A wave of disappointment washed over Elena, so sharp it felt like grief. What good were old papers? "What is it, child?" Sophia asked, her voice a whisper. "Just letters," Elena said, her voice flat. She picked up the bundle. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a pale brown. She carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. It began, "My dearest Arturo." Arturo, her grandfather. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Sophia, whose face had gone pale. Together, huddled by the weak light of the fire, they began to read. The letters were from a woman named Isabella. She wrote of the desert, of the heat, of her work on the ranch. She wrote of Arturo's kindness to her, a poor migrant worker. She wrote of how she had nursed him through a fever when no one else would come near. The letters charted a story of a deep, secret love, a connection that transcended class and propriety. Then came the letter that changed everything. "My love," Isabella wrote, her handwriting shakier than in the others. "I carry a part of you with me now, a new life, our son." Sophia let out a small, sharp gasp. She put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "My Arturo," she whispered, "a whole life, and I knew nothing." There was no anger in her voice, only a profound, bottomless sorrow for the secrets her husband had carried to his grave. Shaken, Elena picked up the small leather diary. It was also Isabella's. The entries were short, sporadic. She wrote of Arturo's plan to build a small house for her and the baby, a place where they could be a family, away from judging eyes, a secret sanctuary. "He is building it with his own hands," one entry read. "Our adobe castle." Elena's eyes darted around the room, at the very walls that surrounded them. This was the house. This was their adobe castle. This wasn't a random ruin. It was a part of their family's hidden history. The final entries in the diary were frantic, filled with fear. Isabella wrote of a sickness sweeping through the area. Her child, Miguel, was ill. She had to leave, to take him to a doctor in the city. "I will come back, my love." The last entry read, "I will come back to our home." But she never had. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This place wasn't just a refuge. It was an inheritance, a legacy. Her fingers, numb with shock, felt something under the velvet lining at the bottom of the box, a false bottom. She pried it up with a fingernail, and there, perfectly preserved, was a single, folded document, a property deed. She unfolded it with reverent hands. The deed was for this very plot of land, this very house. And the owner's name, written in her grandfather's bold, clear script, was Miguel Castillo, the son of Arturo and Isabella, her mother's half-brother, her uncle. The revelation struck them like lightning. This house, their sanctuary, was rightfully theirs, passed down through a secret branch of their family tree. Her uncles, Luis and Jorge, had no claim to it. They were safe. They were home. A wave of relief, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over Elena. She looked at Sophia, whose face was wet with tears, but a small wondrous smile was on her lips. They were no longer victims. They had a history. They had a right. And in that precise moment of triumph, they heard it. The sound that had haunted Elena's nightmares. The low, aggressive rumble of an engine growing closer. Headlights cut a swath through the darkness, sweeping across the front of the house, illuminating the dusty windows. Elena's blood ran cold. The chimney, the smoke from their fire. They had been seen. "Get down!" she hissed, her voice choked with renewed terror. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. Grabbing the box, she pulled Sophia toward the small bedroom. They huddled in the corner, holding their breath, listening to the sound of the truck door slamming shut. They were no longer alone. The villains had returned. The front door shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against it. The old wood groaned but held. "I know you're in there." Luis's voice was a furious roar that ripped through the night. "I saw the smoke, you stupid little creature. You can't hide from me." Elena's heart felt like a trapped bird, beating wildly against her ribs. She clutched the wooden box to her chest as if it were a shield. Sophia's hand found hers in the darkness, her grip surprisingly strong. They could hear 2 sets of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, circling the house, testing the windows. A loud crash echoed from the main room as one of the windows shattered. "There's nowhere to run," Luis taunted from outside. A moment later they heard the scrape of the door being unlatched from the inside. The heavy door creaked open. They were in. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, praying they wouldn't be found. She could hear them moving around the main room, their heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, the sound of things being overturned and thrown. "Where is it?" Luis bellowed. "Where's the money you stole?" "There is no money, Luis," Jorge's nervous voice whined. "She wouldn't have come out here if she had money." "She's hiding something," Luis snapped. "I know it. I can feel it." Their footsteps grew closer to the bedroom door. Elena's breath hitched. This was it. The door was thrown open with a violent bang, smashing against the wall. The powerful beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, pinning them in its glare like terrified animals. Luis stood in the doorway, a dark, hulking silhouette. His face, illuminated from below by the flashlight, was a demonic mask of fury. "Well, well, look what we have here," he sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. He stepped into the room, his presence sucking all the air out of the small space. Jorge lingered behind him, a pathetic, fearful shadow. "What do you want from us?" Elena asked, her voice trembling but defiant. She instinctively moved to shield her grandmother. "I want what's mine," Luis said, his eyes fixated on the box in her hands. "What's in the box? The old woman's jewelry? Money she had stashed away?" He took another step, his hand outstretched. "Give it to me." "It's nothing," Elena said, hugging the box tighter. "It's just old papers." Luis let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You ran all the way out to this dump for old papers? Don't lie to me." He lunged forward, and his hand closed around her arm like a vice. The pain was sharp and immediate. His fingers dug into her flesh. A primal rage, born of fear and desperation, erupted inside Elena. The terror that had paralyzed her moments before was burned away, replaced by a white-hot fury. "Don't you dare touch her!" The voice that came out of her was not her own. It was low, guttural, and filled with a power that surprised even herself. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was like iron. Sophia cried out, "Luis, please, stop this. You're hurting her." Luis ignored his mother completely. His face was inches from Elena's, his breath hot and foul. "You are going to give me that box," he hissed, his eyes wild and deranged, and then suddenly the doorway was filled with a blinding white light. A figure stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the night. "Is everything okay in here?" a man's voice asked. It was calm, steady, but held an undeniable edge of authority. Luis froze. He dropped Elena's arm as if it were a hot coal and spun around, shielding his eyes from the glare of the powerful flashlight. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shifting from aggressive to defensive. "This is private property." The stranger took a step into the room, lowering his flashlight just enough so they could see his face. He was a man in his late 30s or early 40s, with a weathered, handsome face, dark hair, and eyes that seemed to see everything. He was dressed in simple work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, and sturdy boots. He looked strong, capable. "I live just over that ridge," the man said, his voice even. "I got a call from a neighbor about some suspicious activity over here, a truck that didn't belong. Looks like they were right." His gaze flickered from Luis to Jorge, then to Elena and Sophia, taking in the scene with a quick, assessing glance. He addressed Elena directly. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Elena could only nod, her throat tight. The stranger's eyes narrowed on Luis. "I know you," he said slowly. "You're Arturo's boy. Luis, isn't it? I've heard your name around town, and not in a good way." The mention of their father's name seemed to rattle Luis. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He was a bully, and bullies were only brave when they had the upper hand. The sudden appearance of this calm, imposing stranger had completely shifted the balance of power. "This is family business," Luis blustered, trying to regain his footing. "It has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me when I find 2 women and a baby, terrified in a dark room with a broken window," the stranger replied, his voice hardening. "Now I think it's time for you and your brother to leave." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Luis glared at the stranger, then at Elena, his face a mask of impotent rage. He knew he was beaten, for now. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Elena. "You will pay for this, both of you." He turned and stormed out of the room, shoving his younger brother out of the way. A moment later, they heard the truck's engine roar to life, the tires spinning in the dirt as it sped away into the night. The silence that descended was profound. The stranger waited until the sound of the engine had completely faded before he turned his full attention back to them. The intense authority in his demeanor softened, replaced by a genuine concern. "My name is David," he said. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Are you sure you're okay?" "Yes," Elena whispered, finding her voice. "Thank you. You saved us." David just nodded. "I saw the smoke from your chimney this afternoon. This place has been empty for as long as I can remember. I was worried." He looked around the small, sparse room. "My mother. She used to talk about this house." At the mention of his mother, something clicked in Elena's mind. She looked at the wooden box still clutched in her hands, then up at David's face. The pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know she was solving began to fall into place. "Your mother?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. "What was her name?" "Isabella," David answered, a flicker of sad memory in his eyes. "She passed away many years ago. Why?" "Isabella." The name from the letters. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. "Please," she said, holding out the box. "Look at this." Puzzled, David took the box. He opened the lid and looked inside. He picked up the bundle of letters, his brow furrowed in confusion. He unfolded one, and his eyes scanned the elegant script. His face went slack with disbelief. He sank down onto the edge of the bed, his strong frame suddenly looking vulnerable. This is my mother's handwriting," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He looked up at Elena, his eyes wide with 1,000 questions. "How did you—" "We found it," Elena explained, her own voice trembling as she recounted the story. Finding the house, the loose brick, the box. She told him about the letters to Arturo, about the diary, about the secret son named Miguel. As she spoke, David's expression shifted from shock to dawning, earth-shattering comprehension. He looked down at the diary, his fingers tracing his mother's name. "She protected me from this past," he murmured. "She changed our name. She never wanted me to know about the hardship she faced here." He looked from the papers to Sophia, who had been watching the scene unfold with a silent, stunned wisdom. "Arturo's son," Sophia said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. She took a slow step toward him. "My husband's son." She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You have his eyes." David looked at the elderly woman, at the mother of the men who had just threatened him, and saw not an enemy, but the wife of the father he never knew. He saw family. He was Miguel. He was home. Elena, watching them, finally showed him the last piece of evidence. The deed. The deed to this house, in the name of Miguel Castillo, his name. A slow, determined smile spread across David's face, chasing away the shadows of the past. He stood up, his shoulders squared, the reclusive stranger replaced by a fierce protector. He looked at Elena, his eyes full of a gratitude and resolve that forged an instant, unbreakable bond between them. "They will not bother you again," he said, his voice a low, firm promise. "You are not alone anymore. This is my house, and my house is your house." In the dusty, forgotten adobe ruin, under the vast desert sky, a family that had been torn apart by secrets and lies was finally, miraculously, made whole. The next day marked the beginning of a transformation, not just for the house but for them all. David arrived at sunrise in his sturdy pickup truck, the bed loaded with supplies. He brought a small generator that hummed to life, flooding the dark rooms with the miracle of electric light. He brought bags of groceries, cans of formula for Leo, thick blankets, and clean clothes. But most importantly, he brought tools and materials, lumber, nails, glass for the broken window. He brought the raw ingredients of a fortress. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. David, with his quiet competence, began to repair the damage wrought by time and neglect. He boarded up the more fragile windows, secured the front door with a new, heavy lock, and expertly replaced the shattered pane. His hands, calloused and capable, moved with a purpose that was mesmerizing to watch. Elena, energized by a hope she hadn't felt in years, worked alongside him. She cleaned with a feverish intensity, scrubbing away decades of grime, polishing the old wood of the table until it shone, airing out the musty rooms until they smelled of clean desert air and fresh pine from the lumber David had brought. Sophia, unable to do the heavy work, found her own role. She sat in a chair by the fire, rocking Leo, her quiet presence a steadying anchor. She would tell stories of Arturo, not the silent, burdened man she had known in his later years, but the vibrant, laughing young man he had once been. David listened, his expression rapt, piecing together the image of a father he had never met. In turn, he shared memories of his mother, Isabella, her strength, her resilience, her fierce love for her son. The house filled not just with light and warmth, but with stories, bridging the gap of 50 years, weaving the torn threads of their family back together. The physical labor of rebuilding the house mirrored the emotional healing that was taking place within its walls. A few days later, David announced, "It's time." He had the box with Isabella's letters and diary, his own birth certificate showing his original name of Miguel Castillo, and a sworn, notarized statement from Sophia, testifying to her husband's secrets. They drove into the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings that served as the county seat. The county records office was a small, quiet room that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Elena watched, her heart pounding, as David laid the documents out for the clerk, a woman with a tired but kind face. He explained the situation calmly and clearly. The clerk listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She examined the old deed, the letters, the birth certificate. She made a phone call. She typed on her computer for what felt like an eternity. Elena held her breath. This was the moment. Everything depended on this. Finally, the clerk looked up. She stamped a document with a satisfying official thud. "The title is clear," she said. "The property at Parcel 7B is registered to Mr. David, formerly Miguel Castillo." She smiled a small, genuine smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Castillo. The house is yours." The relief was so immense, Elena felt light-headed. It was real. It was official. They had won the first, most important battle. As they walked out into the bright sunlight, David turned to her, a grimly determined look on his face. "Now," he said, his voice low, "let's go visit my brothers." The drive to the house Elena had been thrown out of was tense. This time, she wasn't a victim fleeing in despair. She was returning with an ally, armed with the truth. They pulled up to the curb. The house looked smaller, somehow meaner than she remembered. Luisa's truck was parked in the driveway. David walked up to the front door and knocked, a firm, authoritative rap. After a moment, the door opened. It was Jorge. His eyes widened in shock when he saw David, and then in fear when he saw Elena standing behind him. "What do you want?" Jorge stammered, trying to block the doorway. "We're here to talk to Luis," David said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He moved past Jorge into the living room as if he owned the place. Luis was sitting in their grandfather's armchair, watching television. He looked up, his face contorting into a mask of rage when he saw them. "Get out of my house!" he roared, jumping to his feet. "Actually, that's what we're here to talk about," David said, his voice dangerously calm. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding about who owns what in this family." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "My name is Miguel Castillo. Arturo was my father." The color drained from Luis's face. He stared at David, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "That's a lie," he finally managed to sputter. "My father didn't have other children. You're a fraud." "Am I?" David said, taking a step closer. "I have my mother's letters. I have my birth certificate. And I have the deed to the adobe house my father built for us. A deed which is now officially registered in my name with the county. That property, and everything on it, is mine." Jorge began to tremble visibly. He looked from David's hard, determined face to his brother's panicked one. The foundation of lies he had stood on for so long was crumbling beneath his feet. Luis, cornered and desperate, did the only thing he knew how to do. He lashed out. "You're a thief! You and this little tramp cooked this up. I'm calling the police." He grabbed the phone and furiously dialed. "I'm reporting you for trespassing and fraud." David didn't flinch. He simply crossed his arms and waited. 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up. A weary-looking officer stepped out and listened impatiently as Luis launched into a frantic, rambling story about a conspiracy to steal his inheritance. The officer listened, then turned to David. "Your side of the story, sir?" David calmly produced the newly certified copy of his title. "The property my half-brothers are occupying is under dispute, officer," he said. "But the property they trespassed on the other night, where they assaulted my niece and threatened my mother, is legally mine. Here's the proof." The officer examined the document carefully. He looked back at Luis, his expression hardening with annoyance. "Sir, this document appears to be in order. This man is the legal owner of that property. As for this house, that's a civil matter. But if I get another call out here wasting police resources, I'll be taking someone downtown for filing a false report. Do you understand me?" Luis was speechless. Humiliation and fury warred on his face. He looked utterly defeated. The officer gave him a final warning glare, tipped his hat to David and Elena, and left. The game had changed, and Luis knew it. As David and Elena turned to leave, Luis's voice, low and venomous, followed them. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You don't know who you're messing with." If this story has moved you so far, if you have felt Elena's anguish and Sophia's strength, leave a like and stay until the end, because what comes now is even more exciting. The victory, though sweet, felt incomplete. There was one more ghost from her past that Elena needed to face. The next day, she asked David to watch Leo and Sophia. She took his truck and drove into the city. She drove to the construction site where she knew Marco worked. She found him on his lunch break, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, laughing with his friends. When he saw her approaching, the laughter died on his lips. He got up and walked to meet her, his expression a mixture of surprise and guilt. "Elena," he said, "what are you doing here?" "I needed you to see him," she said, mum. She didn't show him a photo. She didn't need to. "He has your eyes, Marco, and your smile. His name is Leo." Marco looked away, shame-faced. "Look, Elena, I know I was a jerk. I panicked." He reached for his wallet. "How much do you need? I can give you some money." The offer, which once might have seemed like a lifeline, was now an insult. Elena held up a hand. "I don't want your money, Marco," she said. her voice clear and strong. She was no longer the scared girl he had abandoned in the cafe. "I just wanted you to know that you have a son, a beautiful, perfect son. And I wanted you to know that we're okay. Help arrived. It just didn't come from you." She saw the flicker of regret in his eyes, the dawning realization of what he had thrown away. But it didn't matter to her anymore. The hold he had on her was broken. She had faced him not to ask for anything, but to close a chapter. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there amidst the noise and dust of his life. She got back in David's truck and didn't look back. The last toxic tie to her past had been severed. As she drove back toward the desert, toward the little adobe house, she said the word aloud. Home. And for the first time, it felt completely true. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Life in the adobe house was simple, but it was rich. David was a constant, steady presence. He and Elena worked together every day, their hands often brushing as they passed tools or materials. A comfortable silence grew between them, punctuated by easy conversation. She saw the way he looked at her, not with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect. It was a look she had never received from a man before. He was wonderful with Leo, who was now crawling and exploring his new world with gusto. David would get down on the floor with him, making silly faces and rumbling noises that sent the baby into fits of delighted giggles. One evening, as David was lifting him up, Leo reached out a tiny hand, patted his cheek, and said his first real word. Dada. The world seemed to stop for a moment. A complex emotion flickered across David's face. Surprise, joy, and a deep, wistful sadness for all he had missed. Elena's heart ached for him and for herself. In that single, simple word, she saw the shape of a possible future. A family forged not from obligation, but from choice and love. But the shadow of her uncles still lingered. One afternoon, David returned from his own small ranch over the ridge, his face troubled. "Someone broke into my tool shed," he said, his voice grim. Elena's blood ran cold. "Did they take anything?" "Just one thing," David said, his eyes dark with suspicion. "A full can of gasoline." The unspoken threat hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Lucia's final, venomous words echoed in her mind. "This isn't over." The fortress they had built suddenly felt terribly fragile. The call came in the dead of night, a jarring ring that shattered the peaceful silence of the desert. Elena, half asleep, fumbled for the cheap cell phone David had bought for her. It was David, his voice tight with an urgency that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her system. "Elena, listen to me," he said, his words fast and clipped. "I was just checking my property line. I found fresh tire tracks. They cut across the back country, heading for your place. They're coming, and they aren't using the road. You have to get out of the house. Now!" His voice was strained. "The gas can. Elena, I think they're going to burn it down." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Fire. The ultimate act of destruction, the final desperate move of a man who had nothing left to lose. Luisa's twisted logic was terrifyingly clear. If the house disappeared, the problem disappeared. The proof, the legacy, all of it would be reduced to ash. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. For a second, she was frozen. Then her survival instinct kicked in. "Grandma!" she screamed, running into the small bedroom where Sophia and Leo were sleeping. "We have to go, now!" Sophia woke with a startled cry. Elena didn't have time to explain. She scooped the sleeping baby from his crib, wrapping him tightly in a blanket. "Hurry!" she urged, pulling her grandmother by the arm. Sophia, confused and frail, stumbled after her. Elena's mind raced. Where could they go? The road. They had to get to the road. David was on his way. They just had to get to the road. She grabbed the precious wooden box from the mantelpiece, the one thing she would not leave behind, and practically dragged Sophia out the front door into the cold, moonless night. The air was still and silent, but it felt charged with a terrible energy. They began to run, stumbling through the scrub brush toward the distant invisible line of the highway. They hadn't gotten 50 yards when the night was torn apart by the roar of an engine. A pair of headlights flared to life. Not on the road, but directly in front of them, cutting off their escape. It was Luis's truck. It screeched to a halt, and the doors flew open. Luis emerged from the driver's side, and in the stark glare of the headlights, Elena could see that he was no longer just an angry man. He was unhinged. His eyes were wide and wild, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was holding the red gasoline can. Jorge scrambled out of the passenger side, his face a mess of tears and terror. "Going somewhere?" Luis asked, his voice a horrifying parody of a casual question. He took a step toward them, and Elena instinctively pushed Sophia behind her, holding Leo tight against her chest. "Luis, stop this madness," Sophia pleaded, her voice trembling. "For the love of God, I am your mother." "You stopped being my mother when you chose them," Luis shrieked, his voice cracking. He gestured wildly with the gas can toward the small adobe house. "That house! Everything is because of that house. It should have been ours, my father's house." "It was never yours, Luis," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the terror that was clawing at her throat. "It belonged to your brother, the brother you never knew." Her words seemed to push him over the edge. With a guttural scream of pure rage, he turned and ran toward the house. "If I can't have it, no one can," he yelled. He began to splash the gasoline against the old dry wooden walls, the fumes instantly acrid and overwhelming in the still night air. "Luis, no, please," Jorge cried, running after him, grabbing his arm. "Don't do it. It's not worth it." Luis shoved him violently to the ground. "Get away from me, you coward!" He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a lighter. He flicked it once, twice. A small, hungry flame sputtered to life, dancing in his crazed eyes. Time seemed to slow down. Elena saw the tiny flame, the gasoline-soaked wall, the mad look on her uncle's face. She saw her home, her sanctuary, about to be consumed by hate. In that same instant, another pair of headlights appeared, bouncing wildly as a vehicle sped across the rough terrain. It was David's truck. He was driving at full speed, his horn blaring. But he was too late. With a final triumphant scream, Luis threw the lighter. The wall erupted, a whoosh of sound and a wave of heat washed over them as a sheet of brilliant orange flame shot up toward the roof. The fire consumed the dry wood with an astonishing, terrifying speed. David's truck skidded to a halt just as the house burst into flames. He leaped out and without a moment's hesitation charged at Luis, tackling him to the ground in a flurry of motion. But Elena wasn't watching them. She was watching the fire. And a single, horrifying thought pierced through her terror. The box. She had dropped the box when she started to run. It was lying on the ground, just inside the open doorway of the burning house. The letters, the diary, the proof of their history, the story of Isabella and Arturo. It couldn't end like this. Without thinking, propelled by an instinct deeper than fear, she thrust Leo into Sophia's arms. "Hold him!" she screamed, and before anyone could stop her, she ran. She ran toward the fire. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin and stealing the air from her lungs. Smoke billowed out, thick and black, blinding her. She covered her mouth and nose with her sleeve and plunged through the doorway into the inferno. The main room was an impossible vortex of flame and smoke. She could hear the roar of the fire, the crackle of burning wood, the shattering of glass. She saw it. The box. It was just a few feet inside, its wood already starting to smoke. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the hot wood. As she grabbed it, a terrible splintering crack echoed above her. She looked up and saw one of the main roof beams, wreathed in flame, beginning to give way. She tried to scramble back, but her foot caught on an overturned chair. She fell, and the burning beam crashed down, pinning her leg. A scream of pure agony was ripped from her throat. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot lance shooting up her leg. She was trapped. The smoke was a choking blanket, and the flames were closing in. This is it, she thought. This is how it ends. Through the haze and the roar, she heard her name. Being screamed, a figure appeared in the doorway, a dark shape against the raging fire. It was David. He had a wet blanket wrapped around his head and shoulders. He saw her, saw the beam, and without hesitation, he ran to her side. He put his shoulder under the heavy burning wood and lifted with a guttural roar of effort. The pressure on her leg eased. She scrambled free, dragging the charred box with her, her leg screaming in protest. "This way!" David yelled, his voice hoarse. The main doorway was a wall of fire. He pointed to the side wall, where the flames had eaten a hole through the adobe. "Go! Go now!" She crawled through the opening, gasping for clean air, and collapsed onto the dirt outside. David followed a second later, just as the entire roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the night sky. They lay there on the ground, coughing, gasping, their faces black with soot. The house was a funeral pyre, a roaring monument to Luis's hatred. But they were alive, and clutched in Elena's arms, blackened and smoking but intact, was the wooden box. In the distance, another sound began to cut through the roar of the fire, a high, piercing wail, growing closer and closer, the sound of sirens. David, in his frantic call to Elena, had made another call first, to the police. Justice was coming. As the first police car and fire engine pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing across the horrific scene, Luis was still struggling under David's weight. He was put in handcuffs, his face a vacant mask of defeat, the fire of his rage finally extinguished. Horace, sobbing hysterically on the ground, began telling the officers everything, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and fear. He confessed to the fraud, the threats, the plan for the fire. He would testify against his brother. The final act of their cruel drama was over. The ashes of the adobe house were still smoldering under the harsh light of the morning sun. The home that had been their sanctuary was gone, reduced to a blackened foundation and a single skeletal chimney pointing a finger at the sky. The air smelled of smoke and loss. Elena stood leaning on a pair of crutches a paramedic had given her, her leg bandaged and throbbing, a testament to her desperate act. Sophia sat in the back of David's truck, holding a sleeping Leo, her face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. They had won. Justice would be served. But they had lost their home. They were, once again, adrift. David walked over to her, his face streaked with soot, his expression gentle. He put a hand on her shoulder. "My house is too big for one man," he said quietly, his voice rough from the smoke. "There are empty rooms. Come live with me, Elena. You and Sophia and Leo, come live with me as family." It wasn't an offer of pity. It was an offer of belonging. Elena looked at this man who had, in the span of a few short weeks, become her protector, her ally, her family. She saw the sincerity in his tired eyes. She looked back at her grandmother, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. "Yes," she whispered, "we will." That first night at David's ranch was surreal. Clean sheets on a soft bed, a warm room that didn't smell of dust or smoke. The quiet hum of a refrigerator. After the ordeal they had been through, these simple comforts felt like the most profound luxuries. For the first time in her entire life, Elena felt completely, unequivocally safe. A week later, a call came from a lawyer David had hired. With Jorge's full confession and the fraudulent documents now exposed, the transfer of Sofia's house in Las Cruces had been annulled. The house Luis and Jorge had stolen was legally hers again. But the victory felt hollow. "I don't want it," Sofia said, her voice firm, when Elena told her the news. She was sitting on David's porch, looking out at the rugged, beautiful landscape. "That house is full of bad memories now. It's poisoned by greed. Sell it." She looked toward the horizon, in the direction of the ruined adobe walls. "This land is where I want to be. This is where Arturo's heart was." They decided to use the money from the sale not to run, but to rebuild. The trial was short. Jorge's testimony was damning, a detailed account of his brother's escalating greed and cruelty. But the most powerful moment came when Sofia took the stand. She stood with a devastating dignity, her small frame radiating a moral authority that silenced the courtroom. She did not look at Luis. "That man," she said, her voice clear and steady, gesturing toward the defendant's table, "is not my son. My son died a long time ago, replaced by a creature of greed and hate." The judge, a stern-faced man with weary eyes, listened to her words. When it came time for sentencing, he looked directly at Luis. "You violated the most sacred bond there is," the judge said, his voice ringing with condemnation. "The bond between a son and a mother. You chose greed over love, violence over family." He sentenced Luis to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. For Jorge, whose testimony had been crucial, the sentence was much lighter: probation and community service. Justice, swift and severe, had finally been served. The rebuilding began. On the same foundation, upon the ashes of the old house, a new one began to rise. David, with his practical knowledge, led the project. But Elena was his shadow, his apprentice. She was no longer a victim to be protected. She was a builder. She learned the names of tools, the feel of wood, the math of measurements. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. Her skin, once pale, was tanned by the sun. She discovered a strength and competence within herself she never knew existed. Leo, now a toddler, took his first real steps on the new subfloor, toddling on unsteady legs straight into David's open arms. The sight filled Elena's heart with a joy so pure it felt like sunlight. The house grew, and so did the love within it, the shared work, the easy companionship, the quiet evenings watching the sunset. It all wove their lives together into a single beautiful tapestry. The mutual respect they had for each other slowly, naturally, blossomed into a deep and profound love. One evening after a long day of work, they stood outside the nearly completed house, admiring their handiwork under a vast, starry desert sky. The new adobe walls glowed in the moonlight. David turned to her, his expression serious. "Elena," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "you and Leo and Sofia, you didn't just give me a house. You gave me back my past. You gave me my father's history. You gave me a family." He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a velvet box. He pulled out a simple, crudely braided ring he had fashioned from a piece of tough twine from Sophia's new herb garden. He held it out to her. "You are the strongest, most resilient person I have ever met," he said. "You rebuilt your life from ashes. Help me build the rest of mine. Marry me, Elena." Tears streamed down Elena's face as she looked from the simple, perfect ring to the face of the man she loved. After a lifetime in a storm, she was finally home. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Years passed. The new adobe house became a home, filled with laughter and love. The small construction business David and Elena started together flourished, becoming a respected local company known for its quality and integrity. They had another child, a daughter they named Isabella, who had her father's calm eyes and her mother's fierce spirit. Sophia lived to be 92, a happy, fulfilled matriarch. She passed away peacefully in her own bed, in the house her husband had built, surrounded by the love of her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. The charred wooden box was never hidden away. It sat in a place of honor on the new mantelpiece above the fireplace. It wasn't a reminder of a painful secret, but a testament to their foundation, a story of love and loss and resilience that they shared openly with their children. They even created a small fund, using profits from their business, to help other families in the county who found themselves in hardship, cast out and alone. One warm evening, many years later, an older Elena and David sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the same yard where a desperate girl had once stood with a baby in her arms. The journey had been brutal, the path paved with betrayal and loss. But it had led them here. It had led them home. The cruel mockery of their worthless inheritance, a baby to care for, had been the very thing that gave Elena the strength to take the first step. The desolate road that seemed to lead to nowhere had, in the end, led them to everything. The house stood as a testament not only to the cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another, but to the incredible unyielding resilience of the human spirit to rebuild, to forgive, and to love. It was proof that no matter how dark the path, the destination can be brighter than we ever dared to imagine. What did you think of Elena's incredible journey from despair to triumph? This story teaches us that even when we are cast out into the desert of our lives, left with nothing, we can find an oasis of hope. It shows us that true family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build with love, respect, and shared struggle. The greatest treasures are not material wealth, but the strength we find in ourselves and the love we give to others. From the ashes of betrayal, the most beautiful futures can be built. If you believe in the strength of family and the power of new beginnings, comment with the word resilience. We love reading your thoughts and sharing in these emotional journeys with you. Thank you for listening to this story with an open heart. Leave your like if it touched you, and subscribe to our channel to see more touching and inspirational stories like this one.